So now it's my pleasure to introduce John Griffith-Jones. John, after a career at KPMG, joined the FSA board in 2012 as the deputy chairman. He became chair of the FCA when it was created in April 2013. He has got an absolutely pivotal role in shaping the development of this new regulator, so it's my pleasure to welcome him tonight and look forward with avid interest to what he's got to say. John, thank you.
Well, Chris, thank you for those kind words. I would also like to thank your chairman, Lord Deben, for his slightly more challenging remarks. My aides back at the ranch didn't tell me that there was no need to prepare a speech because he would give me 4 headings to which I could usefully address myself. That I would have done in extremis, but fortunately I did bring a few prepared remarks with me, and I think I score probably 3 out of 4, if not a full house, on the points that you challenged me to address. So look, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure and indeed a privilege to join you here this evening. It's a pleasure, genuinely, because I am a great believer in the importance both of APFA and of the advisor community. After all, I was myself an advisor for 38 odd years, so I do know a little bit about clients that are happy and clients that are not. It's also a privilege because, as I've discovered as a regulator, and rather to my cost over the last year or so, that invitations to good dinners come a bit fewer and further in between when you're part of the establishment. This is a great and pleasurable exception to that rule. I'm a little troubled also to be placed on table 13. This is a privilege that doesn't often get offered to the chairman of the Financial Conduct Authority, and I hope isn't a symbolic indication of things to come. Look, the relationship between the FCA and the advisory industry is a truly vital one, and has arguably never been important than it is right now to get right. For consumers to access wisely such a competitive market, it is really essential that there are experts available to help them navigate the array of complex decisions that face them. And so when I arrived at the FCA, now nearly 2 years ago, I made it my business to find out not only how our organization was viewed by the really large firms that we regulate, but also by the smaller ones, many of whom are your members, and many of whom provide advisory services. And the most mentioned messages that I got back from the advisory community around the country, and I did go around the country, were actually threefold. Message number 1, John, we want to do the right thing. We certainly don't want to get in trouble with you or the FOS, but your rules are extremely complicated and you need to know that. Message number 2, we want to have access to you when we need to understand what you are asking us to do, or at least we need to have clarity about what the rules actually are. And message number 3, which was not such a good one, was that the commonly understood meaning of the words advice versus guidance and restricted versus independent had been, shall I say, very severely stressed by the input from the regulator, amongst others. I appreciate the first message. We've worked really hard at the second message, and I have to acknowledge that the third message remains a little bit of an issue. But the message that I did not get, at least not in a wholesale basis, was a rejection of the RDR project overall. Having said that, I do rather vividly recall my first meeting with a rather important and senior politician who quite forcefully told me, as is the wont of most senior politicians, that the whole thing should be delayed by at least a year for the fear of the industry being quite unable to cope, and that we risk some sort of market meltdown unless we basically just gave an extension before we introduced the rules. Well, 18 months on, and you all look remarkably alive and well to me. And I'm extremely glad that my organization took the decision that it did to proceed with the project. And as it turns out, it's just as well we did, because the reforms to the retirement market that are now less than, whatever it is, 7 months away, will only increase the need and value of quality financial advice from people like yourselves. And so you could say that out of adversity has sprung opportunity. And we both share the common and urgent aim of helping the consumer to achieve their financial goal and to plan for their long-term future. And for the vast majority of people in this country, I am in entire agreement with your chairman. The best way to do this will be with and through the assistance of a properly qualified advisor. And it is perhaps because the industry is so important that we have been talking about ways it could be improved for so long, and that so much well-intentioned, and I have to say for the most part good-natured, debate has been generated between ourselves and the industry. I believe it is now over 8 years since my predecessors officially began talking about the need for a collective shift away from product and provider bias towards an appropriately regulated distribution system. And in the past 5 years, probably longer, we've seen some really significant change, and for the better. From an industry where there was reliance by many advisory firms on product providers for remuneration by some form of commission, often hidden, for training and for other support, to one that is more resilient and more transparent with its customers in terms of price and services, and in my opinion, thoroughly fit for the 21st century ahead of us, as opposed to the 20th century behind us. And in many respects, the early days of change were all about distribution, hence the name Retail Distribution Review. However, alongside these changes, we have also seen an equally significant shift toward an industry with increased standards of professionalism. And this, to me, is really, really important, because the old FSA always saw the RDR as creating the framework for the industry to turn itself into a genuinely qualified profession. And now we are seeing this transformation happening in practice, and actually we want to help, support, and encourage the progress that is being made. Because for us, when we talk about professionalism, we mean something much more than professional qualifications, exams, and certificates. Rather, we mean a state of mind that detects how you would conduct yourself and how you conduct your firm when you're actually dealing with customers. And we have all learned, somewhat painfully, from the banking sector, that the tone at the top is absolutely no substitute for the tone at the till when it comes to the expectations of the public. And the simple and age-old parable, do as you would be done by, I think lies at the very heart of good advice. If you're happy to sell it to your mother-in-law, you're probably happy to sell it to anybody. And I'm sure the same is true of financial advisors. So the questions that my colleagues in the regulator are asking when they now go and visit the advisory firms are fourfold. And they're pretty obvious. What is the firm's business model? What is the culture of the organization? How does it run its business affairs? And does it genuinely keep its clients at the heart of its business in practice, as well as on the sign as you come through the front door? This is our focus. And I think it's really very different from what you might have seen from us in the past. It's a focus that needs to permeate through the whole of the firm, from the advisors, through the office managers, through the compliance officers that you no doubt feel obliged to employ, and of course, most importantly, the senior management at the top of the organization. Much, much less, please, as far as we're concerned, in dealing with ticking of boxes, and much more on whether it is putting professionalism into practice at that all-important interface with the client. And we see it very much as our role, that is at the FCA, to facilitate this transition from an industry to a true profession. And the message from me, you will not be surprised to hear, is that we both want you and need you to succeed on this journey. And indeed, we can only fully meet our objectives if you meet those that we are setting you. So just like the firms we regulate, we, the regulator, need to be open and transparent, or in the words of your chairman, to be fully accountable for the actions that we take. And I would like to think that we're making pretty stalwart efforts to do just that, and I can point to some examples. We recently published the outcome of our work on the perceived expectation gap between the regulators and the industry as to what was expected. I can assure you that that was one of my most important projects when I arrived at the organisation, and it took a considerable effort, shall we say, to make that happen. This work considered the genuine differences held in understanding between the regulator and the industry and how that might affect the quality of products and services that customers receive, or unintentionally inhibit consumer-friendly innovation, another of your points, because of the sort of web of regulation. And we have therefore also been out and asked industry whether market development was being held back by uncertainty about our rules or concern over retrospection, which we frequently hear in our travels. And in response to all this, we have launched something called Project Innovate, which I admit has yet to deliver, but give it its due, it's only about 2 weeks old, where we really want the regulators to regulate innovation into existence as opposed to regulate innovation out of existence, as was earlier suggested. And we are consulting on what this dreaded words advice and guidance do and do not mean, and what is not a personal recommendation, and so on and so forth, in a genuine attempt to make our rules understandable and easier to work with. As you know, we've carried out 2 cycles of thematic work looking at how the industry is adopting to RDR post the introduction of the rules. A 3rd cycle is currently underway, and whilst there are undoubtedly teething troubles, it was ever thus, I remain confident that you and we collectively are on a progressively satisfactory journey. Now, we are in the process of finalising our post-implementation review of RDR, and this is something I look forward to with some combination of nervousness and indeed optimism, because after all, RDR has not been a cost-free exercise, and it will be important, indeed an obligation on us, to make as thorough an assessment as we can, now 18 months in, as to whether this exercise has been worthwhile at this stage of its journey as far as the customer is concerned. And after all, it is the customer who are the people for whom this was all done. And in this vein, we as your regulator, and I certainly as its chairman, must be big enough to admit that we may not get things completely right first time round, especially with big innovations like this, and that if we don't, we make sure we listen to common sense, and as it were, that the Mark II version will be better than the Mark I one. And so in this vein, and in response to, again, industry feedback, we have tried recently to clarify our rules on independent financial advisors and the use of internal specialists and how this works in practice. And we have tried to make our data reporting, I'm sure one of the things that you look forward to most in your relationship with the FCA, a little bit easier than it has been in the past. And equally, and probably most importantly, there remains much talk of the number of people who do not have access, for one reason or another, to any advice at all. The reasons for this are pretty well rehearsed, if not universally agreed, and we are extremely sensitive to this point, not least because the objective that we were set by Parliament was to make markets work well and not just to stop them working badly, which can much more easily be achieved by preventing them from working at all. So we are particularly interested in the use of technology to lower the cost of appropriate advice or guidance to those whose assets are insufficient to meet full-scale advice economically and the current typical charges that entails. So the FCA was born just before the RDR came into effect, and I would be understating the case if I were to say that it received absolutely universal support amongst advisors when first discussed. And given the scale of reforms, it's hardly surprising that they elicited what I would generously describe as a mixed response on day one. But if we didn't win the battle on day one, I remain convinced that we are winning the war. And in particular, I believe, and I will challenge anybody in this room or outside, that it is impossible to disagree with the reform's broad aims. And indeed, over the coming years, MiFID II and other European directives will help embed the principles of transparency, bias-free investment advice and professionalism, which were central to our RDR reforms and probably initiated the European movement along the same lines a few years later. So look, what's the conclusion? I believe we've come a long way, but I admit we've still got a long way further to go. Whilst we're not, as regulator and firms, going to agree on absolutely everything, I can assure you that we will always listen. I hope the early evidence of the FCA is that that's the case, and that our door is always open to ideas that are better than our own. And actually, it's through discussions with bodies like APFA that allow us to hear from the industry and to sense-check our thinking. So I'd like to close by thanking Chris and his team for their constructive engagement with the FCA. I would like to wish you all the very best for your 15th anniversary, and indeed for another 15 excellent years to follow as a business organisation. And most importantly, I'd like to wish all of those of you who work in the business a happy and prosperous 2015 as we move forward into the uncertain world of pensions reform. So thank you very much.